Hey everyone, this is Jay and welcome back to Step by Step Coding. And we are going to cover today question number 8 in our top 100 C Sharp interview questions and answers. We are going to cover the topic, what is an interface? So let's jump it right away. What exactly is interface? So a interface is a contract, a blueprint. It defines what a class must do, but not how it does it. So if you take a look, we have a contract left hand side and then which is having a method and property. So what actually it means that a interface can contain methods and properties, and normally it doesn't contain the implementation. Uh, but I want to put a disclaimer here that before C Sharp 8.0, you cannot have the implementation within the interface. But after the C Sharp 8.0, you can have the implementation. And this is very important, the stuff which you should be knowing it. Now, if it sound confusing, let's right away jump into the code to understand it. And then with the example, we will try to understand what is interface, when to use it, and what is the whole purpose, why interface does exist. Okay, so let's jump into the code right away. So so think about it, that there is a small application and there is a need to save the data somewhere. It could be, it could be database, it could be on a file system, it could be somewhere else, right? So the ask case are the use cases that we need to save the data, uh, but we do not know, I mean, save where. It can be anywhere, right? So this is a perfect example. I mean, what we will do, I mean, we can define an interface, we can define a contract, and that contract can have two behavior, two function, the save and load. So let's take a look, right? Interface has been defined, and normally you define interface starting with the word, the letter I, which indicates that it is interface, and which differentiates that it is a class versus the interface, and then you put the keyword interface, and then within that you have this, the two methods. Now we do not have the body of this method. Now, traditionally, this is how you used to define a methods or property in an interface. In other words, I mean, this is a abstract method. What is abstract methods? A method which is not having implementation. So traditionally, I mean, if you ask, a interface used to be a pure 100% abstract class where it's not having any implementation at all. It's just having a definition, a contract of the methods, and whatever the class used to implement that interface, they used to put all, the class used to put all the logic, whatever the, logic of that method. Okay, but with the C Sharp 8.0, you can have, the default implementation. You can have a body. What actually I mean, that it's perfectly okay to do something like this. I'm just, giving example, right? Normally save is having, your input output and all that logic, right? But I'm just trying to demonstrate it, that after C Sharp 8.0 you can have the, the default implementation. Okay, Java introduced first, and then, the C Sharp introduced as well this concept. But in terms of, the logic behind the interface, that remains same. That idea behind the interface is that you can have, a contract which you define here, and then if it's having a contract, what does it mean, how you use it. So the way you use it, that class has to implement it. Okay, so how class will implement it? So you will have another class. You will have a class, let's say it is a user setting, and we are actually trying to save this setting into somewhere, and that class has to implement it. And how do you implement it? You use the same colon, the syntax, and then you put that interface name. So what actually it means that this class is going to implement this interface, and then within this class what it will do, it will have the implementation logic of the methods which is defined in the interface. So we had two methods here, and then if you see here we have both these methods is having their own logic. Okay, so this is how a class implements an interface. This is how interface the works. Now let's try to understand that what is the whole use of the interface, when do you use it, right? So idea behind the interface is that you define a contract, and uh, uh, then any class which has to implement it, it's going to put that logic. Okay, so why and exactly when to use interface, what is exactly is the benefit? So the first one is that you achieve abstraction and loose coupling. And what does it mean? So it helps you to hide implementation details. In other words, think about it that this user setting, right? if if the user setting, the changes, in other words, the implementation, the storing the data change from file to a database, as long as it is still fulfills these two contracts, save and load, it is perfectly fine, right? You still adhere, you still the follow your contract. So that is what interface does, that it promotes the loose coupling, making your code more modular and easier to maintain. It defines a contract which a class has to follow it, right? So number one, that is one. It promotes abstraction and loose coupling. What is the other benefits? The other benefit is that you can do the multiple, the inheritance. C sharp doesn't allow, the multiple inheritance traditionally through, through the classes. But with the interface, you can do the multiple inheritance. What does it mean? That you can define multiple interfaces, and then your C sharp can implement multiple interfaces. So that is one of the biggest advantage which interface provides it. So in nutshell, right? I mean, in nutshell, what exactly what exactly is the interface is? So interface is the pure contract. At least the idea is that you define the contract. Like I said, after C sharp 8.0, you can have a default the body. uh, and what actually it means that you define a default implementation, and the class which is going to implement it, it's having a option to override that behavior. If it doesn't override the behavior, your the default implementation which you put in the interface, that is going to be used. Okay, so you have contract, you have default implementation, you cannot have constructors, you cannot have field. And you cannot have constructors. Why? Because you cannot create a object. Just like the abstract class interface, also you cannot create a objects, and that is why you do not have the constructors. It's not having any data, right? I mean, when I say data, you cannot declare any the variables. You cannot have. Second thing, class has to implement the interface. It has to fulfill the contract, whatever is defined by within the interface. Third, all the members are implicitly public and abstract. So what I mean that, I mean, if if we take a look this code, right? If we go here, and if you see here, we do not have any the any access modifier where we are defining whether it's a private or public, right? So by default, it's a public as well as the abstract. Okay, and And the last one, it allows to uh, uh, it allows to implement you the multiple the inheritance. That is one of the the biggest advantage with the with the interface you can achieve that. So that's it. I mean, we that's it for the today episode, where I mean we covered the interface. If you like this episode, please go ahead, uh, thumbs up, as well as the subscribe, leave a comment, or if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you so much for watching.